So in this video we're going to introduce the topic of macroeconomics. So what is it? What do we mean when we talk about macroeconomics? Well, macro means large. So in macroeconomics we consider the performance of the whole economy, as opposed to microeconomics where we were looking at specific markets and specific goods. So in macroeconomics we try to understand things like how quickly our economy is growing, what's happening to prices, what's happening with jobs, and how are we trading with other countries? Are we doing well with that or not so well? So in macroeconomics we also look at what the government is doing to try to maximise the economic performance of the company, and we look at whether those policies are succeeding or not. So what is the real difference between micro and macro? Well, as I said, when we studied microeconomics in the first half of this semester, we looked at specific industries like the tourist industry, or perhaps how the government might give a subsidy to a particular industry like steel, or how a downturn in the economy might affect one industry like textiles. In macroeconomics, we're looking at the whole economy. So what's happening to economic growth? How is that connected to consumer spending across the whole economy? What's happening with our exports, and how is that affected by what's happening in other countries? And what about the money the cost of borrowing money, interest rates? What does that have to do with anything? So these are all the kinds of things that we study in macroeconomics. So the first thing that I really want to talk about is this word, the economy. We keep mentioning, but what do we really mean? Well, the economy is made up of four sectors or economic agents. And if you remember, an economic agent is a group of people who make decisions in a mixed economy. So, for example, every time we buy something as consumers, we're helping to make that decision about what is produced and who gets what is produced. So the first economic agent that we're going to look at is households. And by households, really, I mean you and me and our families. We're the people who go out to work and we receive payment, wages for our services. We might also own land that we rent out to businesses, and we get rent in return we get rent for that. We also go out and we shop. We spend money in the shops. So that's households. Then there are firms or businesses. They are the economic agents who use our labour and who use our capital, the money we save in the bank. They might borrow, and they might use that to invest in machinery to produce goods and services. They pay us wages, they pay us rent if they're using our land, and if they borrow money, they obviously pay interest. So firms are the second economic agent. The third one is government, and we know what governments do, I hope. Governments tax us, don't they? And they use that income from tax to provide public services in most countries. The fourth economic agent we call international, and this is to take account of the fact that we don't just produce goods and services for people in our own country, we also produce goods and services that we export. And every country also buys goods and services from other countries we import. So we have our four economic agents: households, firms, governments, and international. And remember, they're all the bodies that make decisions in a mixed economy. So we know what an economy is. How do we measure an economy? How do we know how big our economy is? How do we know that our economy is getting bigger or smaller? How do we know that it's bigger than that of another country? So we measure our economy using an indicator that we call gross domestic product, or GDP. And we have a short video here that explains that rather nicely.
The gross domestic product, or GDP, of a country is calculated by adding up all of the final goods and services we buy in a quarter or in a year. Say a baker buys wheat and butter to make bread. The cost of those raw materials is included in the final price of the bread we buy. The price of that bread, along with the final price of everything we buy, such as food, clothing, or electronics, is added to what the government spends on education, the health system, and other services. This creates that big number called GDP, or nominal GDP, which includes all of a country's exports while subtracting its imports. But it's not so simple to calculate GDP growth. If prices have gone up in a year, it means inflation is included. So it will not show whether a country has actually produced more goods and services. Price fluctuations can hide the real state of the economy. So by simply subtracting inflation to get the real story of whether a country's economy is contracting or growing, that is when economists use real GDP.
Okay, so we were introduced there to a few concepts, the most important one being gross domestic product. This is how we measure our economy, and as we heard, it's a monetary value of all the goods and services that are produced within an economy, in this case within the UK, in a given time period. It includes everything from farming and fishing, that's primary sector, to manufacturing and construction in the secondary sector, and also things like education and healthcare and retail in the tertiary sector. When we talk about gross domestic product, we can also think about this as being the same as national income, or national output, or aggregate demand. For our purposes in this module, we can think of all of those things as being pretty much the same thing. In the video, they distinguish between GDP and real GDP, and we learned that this real GDP is GDP adjusted for changes in the price level. And that's really important because if we want to compare GDP over time, we need to know whether our country is actually producing more or whether it's just that prices have gone up. So real GDP is GDP with the effects of any inflation taken out. The other thing that we need to think about is GDP per capita. Capita means head. So GDP per capita is GDP per head of population. In other words, we take the total amount of GDP for the whole country and we divide it by the number of people in the country. That gives us our GDP per capita or GDP per head figure. We've mentioned economic growth as well. So now that we know GDP, we can measure economic growth by comparing the GDP in one time period to the GDP in another time period, and we can look at the percentage rate of increase of real GDP. Okay, in our next video we're going to have a look at measures of economic performance, but for now there are a few questions for you to answer.